My name is Chloe Miller. I'm 31 years old. And last week, my father sent me a text message that didn't just break my heart. It officially ended our family as I knew it. I was standing in the kitchen of the large colonial-style house in Seattle, the home I had spent the last 3 years of my life trying to save, when my phone buzzed on the granite countertop. No, hello. No, how are you? Just a cold, calculated command from a man who had spent decades teaching me that loyalty was everything, only to prove he didn't possess a shred of it himself. The text read, "We are going on a Hawaii trip with Mark's family. We've locked the main house. You stay in the servant room." I read those words 3 times, waiting for a follow-up, a just kidding, or even a reason. But the screen stayed dark. My brother Mark, his wife Sarah, and their 2 kids were heading to a luxury resort on my father Robert's dime. While I was being treated like an unwanted squatter in my own childhood home, I could hear them upstairs, the heavy thud of suitcases being dragged across the hardwood, the excited screams of my nephews, and the muffled laughter of a family that had already decided I wasn't part of the picture. I walked into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs, and found my father adjusted his tie in the mirror. "Dad?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I saw the text. Why don't you let me go? I've worked 60-hour weeks to help with the bills here. I've sacrificed everything for this house." He didn't even turn around. He just looked at my reflection with a coldness that made the air in the room feel thin. "You are a leech, Chloe," he said, and the venom in his voice was sharper than any blade. "You've lived under my roof for 31 years. You haven't earned a vacation. We won't let your presence and your constant struggle spoil the joy of a real family trip." "A leech?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "I'm the one who paid for the new roof last summer. I'm the one who covered the property taxes when your investments went south. That's what a daughter does," he snapped, finally turning to face me. "But you don't get to demand a seat at the table just because you did your duty. Now, take your things to the storage room out back. We've already set the alarm. If you try to enter the main house while we're gone, the police will be here in 4 minutes." He walked past me, grabbing his suitcase, and didn't look back. He chose his version of the family over the daughter who had actually held them together. But as I watched their SUV pull out of the driveway, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. That had burned out. It was a cold, hard clarity. They expected to come back to a submissive daughter waiting on the porch with an apology. Instead, when they returned exactly 24 hours later, they found the locks changed, a team of legal auditors in the living room, and a reality they were never prepared to face. My father called me a leech, but he forgot one very important thing. Paper remembers what feelings forget. To the outside world, I was a success story. A 31-year-old junior architect at a top firm in Seattle, a city where you have to be sharp just to survive. I spent my days designing beautiful, open-concept homes for families who actually seemed to like each other, sketching out nurseries and sunlit kitchens, all while returning every night to a house that felt more like a battlefield than a home. I wasn't some lazy kid failing to launch. I was a professional woman who had stepped up when her family was sinking, only to be stepped on in return. I grew up in that colonial house. I knew the exact way the front door stuck in the humidity and how the light hit the backyard in the late afternoon. But to my father, Robert, and my brother Mark, I wasn't a daughter or a sister, I was a convenient resource. Someone to blame when things went wrong and someone to bankroll them when the bills came due. But before I tell you how I turned their luxury Hawaiian vacation into a permanent exit from the house they thought they owned, I want to take a moment to connect with you. If you've ever been the responsible one who gets treated like the problem child while doing all the heavy lifting, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach more women who are finding their voice. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is right now. I read through these to see where our community is growing. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of the end. To understand why they felt so comfortable locking me in a servant room, you have to understand the financial lie we'd been living for the past 3 years. Let me take you back to 3 years ago, the moment the trap was first set. I was 28 then, living in a beautiful studio apartment in downtown Seattle, just starting to make a name for myself at the firm. Life was good, but then I got the call. My father, Robert, sounding smaller and more defeated than I'd ever heard him. He told me he'd made a miscalculation. He'd sunk a massive portion of his retirement into a tech startup that folded within 6 months, and now the family home, the 1920s craftsman in Queen Anne that had been in our family for generations, was at risk. "Chloe," he'd said, his voice cracking over the phone, "I can't ask Mark. He's got the kids. He's got Sarah to look after. But you're doing so well. If you move back, just for a while, and help me keep the lights on, we can save this place." Being the good daughter, I didn't hesitate. I packed my life into boxes, broke my lease, and moved back into my childhood bedroom. We sat at the heavy oak dining table that very first night, and we made a deal. It was a private agreement, scribbled on the back of a property tax statement. I would pay the mortgage directly, $2,800 every single month, and in return, I wouldn't have to worry about rent or utilities. Robert said it was a way for me to invest in my future while helping him in his time of need. But the moment I moved in, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't the savior of the family home. I was the unmarried daughter who couldn't cut it on her own. That was the story Robert started telling everyone at Sunday brunch and neighborhood barbecues. He'd lean back with a beer and say, "Yeah, Chloe's back. It's tough out there for her, I guess. We're happy to give her a roof over her head until she gets her feet under her." It was a lie, and a calculated one. But the real sting came from my brother Mark. Mark is 34, a consultant whose primary job seems to be spending money he doesn't have. While I was working 60-hour weeks at the architecture firm, coming home with coffee-stained blueprints and aching eyes, Mark was pulling into the driveway in a brand-new Ford F-150 that cost more than my annual salary. Every night at dinner was a performance. Sarah, Mark's wife, would talk about their upcoming trips or the $800 Waldorf Astoria stroller they'd just bought for the kids, while Robert would look at me and sigh. "Must be nice to have no responsibilities, Chloe. Just living here, eating our food, using the high-speed internet I pay for. You're lucky we don't charge you market rate." I'd look at him, my fork trembling in my hand, thinking about the $2,800 that had left my bank account just 2 days prior to cover the mortgage he couldn't afford. "Dad, you know I pay my share," I'd say quietly. "Your share?" Mark would chime in, his mouth full of the steak I'd bought on my way home. "Chloe, you pay a pittance. You're a leech, sis. You're 31 and living in your old bedroom. If it weren't for Dad's charity, you'd be in some roach-infested basement in South Seattle." It became a daily ritual of humiliation. They needed my money to keep the lifestyle they weren't willing to work for, but they needed my submission even more to feel superior. Robert began treating me like a glorified house sitter. If the gutters needed cleaning, it was Chloe's job because she's living here for free. If Sarah wanted a night out, I was the expected babysitter because it's the least I could do for the family. I remember one specific Tuesday about 6 months ago. I'd just landed a junior partnership track at work. I came home excited, wanting to celebrate. I'd even brought home a nice bottle of wine. I walked into the kitchen and found Robert and Mark looking over travel brochures for Hawaii. "Oh, good. The leech is home," Mark said, not even looking up. "Hey, Chloe, the dishwasher is full. Be a pal and empty it before you start whatever important work you've got tonight." "I actually have some great news," I started, but Robert cut me off. "Unless that news is you finding your own place so Mark can turn your room into a playroom for the boys, I don't want to hear it," Robert snapped. "You're taking up space, Chloe. You're an adult woman living off her father's hard work. It's embarrassing." That was the moment I realized that my $2,800 a month wasn't buying me respect. It was buying me a front row seat to my own character assassination. Over those 3 years, I had funneled over $100,000 into that house. I had saved the property from foreclosure twice. I had paid for the new HVAC system when it blew in the dead of winter. And yet, in their eyes, I was a parasite. They had spent 3 years gaslighting me, making me feel like I was the one in debt to them. They used my guilt, my love for the house, and my sense of family duty to bankroll Mark's luxuries and Robert's pride. But while they were busy mocking me for being a leech, they were also getting sloppy. They forgot that I'm an architect. I don't just look at walls, I look at structures. I look at foundations. And I had started looking very closely at the legal foundation of the house we were all sitting in. I'd spent those 3 years quietly keeping every receipt, every bank transfer record, and every private agreement Robert had signed when he was desperate for cash. They thought they were locking a leech out of the house. They didn't realize they were locking out the only person who actually held the deed to their lives. The morning of their departure was a whirlwind of expensive luggage and high-pitched excitement. I remember the smell of fresh coffee and the frantic energy of Sarah trying to make sure the kids had their iPads and noise-canceling headphones for the long flight. I was in the kitchen, making breakfast sandwiches for everyone, still operating under the delusional hope that maybe, just maybe, this was all a test or a misunderstanding. I had spent the previous night looking at my bank account, seeing the $2,800 deduction for the mortgage that had cleared just 48 hours prior, and I told myself that no father would take $100,000 from his daughter over 3 years and then leave her behind like a piece of unwanted furniture. I was wrong. "Chloe, where are the extra travel pillows?" Sarah called out from the hallway, not looking at me, her voice sharp with the stress of someone who was about to spend 10 days in a 5-star resort in Maui. "They're in the linen closet, Sarah," I said, handing a wrapped sandwich to my 7-year-old nephew, Leo. He looked at me with big, innocent eyes and asked, "Auntie Chloe, aren't you coming to see the volcanoes with us?" The room went silent. Mark stopped zip-tying a suitcase in the living room. Sarah froze by the stairs. My father, Robert, walked into the kitchen, his Hawaiian shirt already on, looking every bit the relaxed patriarch of a successful family. He didn't look at Leo. He looked at me, and his eyes were like flint. "Leo, go help your dad with the bags," Robert said firmly. Once the boy was gone, he turned his full attention to me. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator that I had paid $1,200 to repair 2 months ago. "I assumed you'd have your things moved out to the back by now, Chloe," he said, his voice flat. "We're leaving in 20 minutes. The car is coming at 9:00 a.m. sharp." "Dad, I've been paying for this house for 3 years," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and disbelief. "I've covered the property taxes, the insurance, and every single repair. You're really going to lock me out of the main house while you go on a trip that costs $15,000, money you wouldn't even have if I wasn't subsidizing your entire life?" Mark stepped into the kitchen then, leaning against the door frame with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Subsidizing? That's a big word for a leech, Chloe. You're not subsidizing anything. You're paying back the debt of being an adult child still living in her daddy's house. Dad's being generous by letting you stay on the property at all." "Generous?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mark, you drive a truck that costs more than my annual salary, and you haven't paid a dime toward this mortgage in years. You're the one living off Dad, and Dad is living off me." Robert slammed his hand onto the counter. "Enough! This is exactly why you aren't coming. You're bitter, you're ungrateful, and you're obsessed with money. We've worked hard to make this a special trip for Mark and the kids. We won't have you dragging us down with your sacrifices and your constant tally-keeping. Family doesn't keep score, Chloe." "Only the people who are winning say that, Dad," I whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single tarnished brass key attached to a cheap plastic ring. He didn't hand it to me. He dropped it on the counter next to the half-eaten sandwiches. "That's for the servant room in the back, the detached storage unit. I've moved your basic necessities out there this morning while you were in the shower. Your bed, a few changes of clothes, and your work laptop. Everything else in this house is under lock and key." My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The servant room was a 10x12 stone structure built into the hill at the back of the property. It was nearly a century old, uninsulated, and used for storing rusted garden tools and old holiday decorations. It didn't even have a bathroom, just a utility sink and a space heater that hadn't been plugged in since the 90s. "You're locking me in a shed?" I asked, my voice cracking. "It's a room," Robert snapped. "And it's more than you deserve given your attitude. We've set the alarm for the main house. If the sensors go off, the security company will call the police immediately. Don't try the windows. Don't try the back door. Just stay in the back, do your work, and maybe when we get back, you'll have found some humility." The car honked in the driveway. The happy family swung into action. They grabbed their bags, their sunglasses, and their excitement, moving past me like I was a ghost. I stood in the middle of the kitchen I had scrubbed, in the house I had saved, and watched them walk out the front door. I saw my father pause at the keypad, his fingers punching in the code that would make me a prisoner on my own land. I heard the heavy clack of the deadbolts engaging, the smart locks I had installed for their safety, turning against me. Through the window, I watched them load into the black SUV. Mark was laughing, Sarah was taking a selfie, and my father was checking his watch, looking satisfied. They didn't look back. Not once. The silence that followed was deafening. I was alone in a locked house, with 20 minutes to gather whatever the alarm would let me take before the exit delay expired. I grabbed my purse and the brass key from the counter. My hand was shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I walked out the side door, the only one left unlocked, and as I stepped onto the porch, I heard the final beep of the alarm system. I was out. I walked down the stone path to the back of the yard, past the manicured lawn and the rose bushes I spent my weekends pruning. At the very edge of the property, tucked under the shadow of a massive cedar tree, was the stone storage room. I pushed the heavy wooden door open, and the smell of dust and damp earth hit me like a physical blow. It was worse than I imagined. My mattress was tossed on the floor, leaning against a stack of old tires. My work bag was sitting on a rusted metal chair. There was a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows against the cold stone walls. It was November in Seattle. The damp cold was already seeping through my shoes. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, my head in my hands. The reality of it finally broke me. My father had taken my money, used my professional skills to maintain his lifestyle, and the moment I asked for a seat at the table, he threw me into the dirt. He called me a leech because it was easier than admitting he was the one feeding off me. But as I sat there, shivering in the dim light, my eyes landed on something in the corner. It was an old wooden filing cabinet, the one my father had moved out here 6 months ago when Mark decided he needed a man cave in the basement. Robert had told me it was just old junk from my grandfather's time. I looked at that cabinet, and then I looked at the heavy locks on the main house. My father thought he had locked me out. He didn't realize that by putting me in this room, he had given me the one thing he had been hiding for 30 years. He had given me the archives. I stood up, wiped the tears from my face, and walked toward the cabinet. My father thought this was my exile. He didn't know it was about to become his eviction notice. The servant room was even colder than it looked. By 11 p.m., the damp Seattle air had turned the stone walls into blocks of ice. I had the small space heater plugged into a shaky outlet, but it did little more than smell like burning dust and orange coils. I sat on the edge of the mattress Robert had thrown on the floor, wrapped in a thin wool blanket I'd managed to snag from my car. Every time I breathed, a small cloud of white vapor appeared in front of me. I looked at the heavy oak door, locked from the outside just like the main house. My father hadn't just put me in the back. He had treated me like a liability that needed to be contained. I felt the weight of every dollar I had ever given him. Every $2,800 mortgage payment, every property tax installment, every repair bill for the plumbing and the roof. It wasn't just money. It was 3 years of my life, my youth, and my professional stability. I had sacrificed my own apartment and my independence to save a man who thought so little of me that he'd left me to freeze in a shed while he sipped Mai Tais in Maui. My eyes kept drifting to the wooden filing cabinet in the corner. It was a heavy, scarred piece of furniture that had belonged to my grandfather, Elias. Robert had moved it out here 6 months ago to make room for Mark's gaming den. He'd told me it was full of sentimental garbage and old utility bills that he didn't have the heart to throw away yet. I needed a distraction from the cold and the buzzing in my head. I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked over to it. The top drawer was stuck, swollen from the humidity. I had to brace my foot against the base and yank it with both hands until it gave way with a loud, metallic screech. Inside, it wasn't just utility bills. I started pulling out folders. At first, it was what Robert said: old bank statements from the 90s, blueprints for a deck that was never built, and expired insurance policies. But as I reached the back of the second drawer, I found a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. It had my name on it, written in my grandfather's precise, elegant handwriting. For Chloe, when the foundation shifts. My heart did a slow, heavy thud. I broke the seal. Inside were the original generational trust and deed papers for the property. I sat back down on the cold floor, the papers spread out in the dim light of the bare bulb. As an architect, I'm trained to read the fine print of contracts, but this wasn't just a building code. This was a blueprint for justice. My grandfather, Elias, hadn't left the house to Robert in a simple will. He knew Robert's history with bad investments and impulsive spending. Instead, he had placed the house in a generational equity trust. The terms were very specific. Robert was the life tenant, meaning he had the right to live there as long as he maintained the property's financial health. However, the trust contained an automatic trigger clause. I traced the line with a shaking finger. Should any direct descendant of the third generation provide more than 40% of the total assessed property value in maintenance, taxes, or mortgage debt servicing over a continuous period of 36 months, the life tenancy of the second generation shall be deemed forfeit, and the title of sole trustee shall pass immediately to said descendant. I felt the air leave my lungs. I reached for my laptop, my fingers flying over the keys. I pulled up my banking app and opened the folder where I'd saved every single receipt for the last 3 years. I started a spreadsheet, my heart racing faster with every entry. Year 1, $33,600 in mortgage payments, plus $8,000 in property taxes. Year 2, $33,600 in mortgage payments, $12,000 for the new roof, $4,000 for the HVAC. Year 3, $33,600 in mortgage payments, plus the current tax installment I'd paid last month. The total was staggering. Because Robert had been struggling and Mark had been a guest, I had effectively been the sole financial pillar of the house. I had reached 46% of the property's assessed value, and that 36-month window, it had closed exactly 22 days ago. According to this paper, Robert wasn't the owner. He wasn't even the landlord. He was a tenant at will who had defaulted on his responsibilities. And I wasn't the leech. I was the owner. I didn't wait. I pulled out my phone and called James Sterling. James was a high-powered property attorney I'd worked with on several firm projects. He was also a close friend who knew exactly how much I'd been struggling with my family. "Chloe, it's midnight. Is everything okay?" James's voice was thick with sleep. "James, I'm in the servant room. They locked me out and went to Hawaii," I said, my voice cracking but staying strong. "But I found the grandfather's trust. I'm sending you a photo of the equity clause and my payment ledger right now. I need you to tell me I'm reading this right." There was a long silence on the other end as he reviewed the files. I could hear the click of his mouse and the rustle of paper. My breath caught in my throat as I waited for the verdict. "Chloe," James finally said, and his voice was no longer sleepy. It was sharp, professional, and almost dangerously calm. "You aren't just reading it right. You're holding a legal nuclear weapon. Under Washington state trust law, this clause is self-executing once the threshold is met. As of last month, Robert's life tenancy was legally terminated. He has no right to the property. He has no right to change the locks. And he certainly has no right to exclude the sole trustee, which is you, from the premises." "So what do I do?" I asked, a surge of power finally beginning to override the cold. You don't do anything tonight. Stay in the room. Keep the heater on. I'm going to draft an emergency trustee assumption notice and a formal eviction for cause for both Robert and Mark. I'll have my locksmith and 2 off-duty deputies meet you at the front gate at 9 a.m. tomorrow. They're coming back tomorrow, I said, remembering Mark mentioning a flight issue. They'll be here by noon. Good, James replied. I love an audience. Chloe, listen to me. They called you a leech while you were the one building the walls they were sleeping in. Tomorrow, we show them what happens when the foundation finally breaks. I hung up and looked at the papers. For 3 years, I had been gaslit into believing I was the problem. I had been told I was taking up space, that I was ungrateful, and that I was lucky to have a roof over my head. But the paper remembered, the bank records remembered, my grandfather's foresight remembered. I laid back down on the thin mattress, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. I felt the weight of the key in my hand, not the brass one to this shed, but the invisible one to the front door. They thought they were enjoying a luxury vacation at my expense. They didn't realize they had just checked into the shortest, most expensive hotel stay of their lives. Tomorrow, the leech was going to take her house back. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours between midnight and dawn in that freezing stone room, but I wasn't shivering from the cold anymore. I was vibrating with a cold, hard adrenaline. By 8:30 a.m., James Sterling had arrived with a specialized locksmith and 2 off-duty King County deputies. While the family was presumably enjoying a luxury breakfast in Maui, I was watching a locksmith drill out the deadbolts I had paid for and replace them with high-security cylinders that my father's key would never turn. It's done, Chloe, James said, handing me a heavy ring of new keys. The emergency trustee assumption notice is posted on the door. The eviction notices for Robert and Mark are ready. Legally, they are trespassing the moment they step over that threshold without your permission. I stood on the porch, wrapped in a black trench coat, looking at the driveway. Around 11:45 a.m., the familiar black SUV pulled into the gate. They were back early. Mark had mentioned a flight issue in a boastful text he'd sent to the family group chat, which I was still technically in, complaining that the airline's mistake had cut their trip short by 8 days. I watched as the SUV came to a halt. The doors flew open. Mark hopped out, looking tan and annoyed, followed by Sarah, who was wrangling the kids. Finally, Robert stepped out. He looked relaxed, his Hawaiian shirt slightly wrinkled, holding a duty-free bag. "What the hell is this?" Mark shouted, spotting the police cruiser parked partially behind a hedge. Robert stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. I was sitting in a wicker chair on the front porch, James standing stoically to my right, the 2 deputies flanking the stairs. "Chloe," Robert called out, his voice rising in that familiar tone of irritation. "Why are the police here? And why are you on the porch? I told you to stay in the back. Did you set off the alarm like a damn child?" He marched up the walkway, reaching into his pocket for his keys. He didn't even wait for an answer. He jammed his key into the lock and twisted. Nothing. He frowned, tried again, and then began rattling the handle with a growing rage. "The lock is stuck. Mark, help me with this door. Chloe, what did you do to the door?" "The lock isn't stuck, Robert," I said. I didn't call him Dad. That word felt like it belonged to a different person, a person who didn't exist. "The lock has been changed, and you're not going to be able to open it." Mark shoved past his father, his face turning a dark, ugly shade of red. "You crazy babak! You locked us out of our own house? Officers, are you seeing this? She's a squatter. We let her stay here out of charity, and she's locked the doors." One of the deputies, a tall man named Miller, stepped forward. "Sir, I need you to step back from the door and calm down. We are here to keep the peace while the owner of the property exercises her legal rights." "Owner?" Robert let out a short, bark-like laugh. "I'm the owner. I've lived here for 40 years. My father built this house. This girl is a leech. She doesn't own a single brick." James Sterling stepped forward then, opening a thick manila folder. "Actually, Robert, that's where you're wrong. My name is James Sterling, legal counsel for Chloe Miller, the sole trustee of the Elias Miller Generational Trust. According to the original deed and the equity trigger clause your father placed in the trust, your life tenancy was terminated the moment Chloe's financial contributions crossed the 40% threshold of the property's value. Robert stared at James, his mouth hanging open. The duty-free bag slipped from his hand, hitting the porch with a dull thud. What are you talking about? That's not... Elias left the house to me. He left you a life tenancy, Robert, James said, his voice dropping into that clinical, lethal tone. A tenancy that was conditional on you maintaining the property. Over the last 36 months, Chloe has paid over $100,000 in mortgage payments, $20,000 in taxes, and nearly $25,000 in major structural repairs. You haven't paid a dime toward the principal in 3 years. According to the law and the trust documents you signed in 2020, you forfeited your rights 22 days ago. Chloe Miller is now the legal owner and trustee. You are, at best, a guest, and as of this morning, your guest status has been revoked. This is a lie, Mark screamed, stepping toward James. The second deputy moved instantly, placing a hand on his belt. Mark froze. You can't do this. We live here. Our kids live here. And you've lived here for free while your sister worked 60 hours a week to keep the roof over your heads, I said, standing up. I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear I had lived with for 3 years was gone, replaced by a crystalline silence. You called me a leech, Mark. You told me I hadn't earned a vacation. You locked me in a stone room without heat while you spent my mortgage money on a Hawaiian resort. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at them. Sarah was clutching the kids, her face pale. Robert looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. I've spent 3 years being the good daughter, I continued. I saved this house from foreclosure twice. I paid for the roof that's over your head right now, and your response was to exile me to a shed. Well, I took your advice. I decided to stop being a leech. I'm not subsidizing your life anymore. Chloe, sweetheart, let's talk about this, Robert said, his voice suddenly shifting to that soft, manipulative tone he used when he needed money. We were just tired. We made a mistake. We're family, right? You wouldn't throw your father and your brother out on the street over a misunderstanding? It wasn't a misunderstanding, Robert. It was a text message, I replied. And you were right about one thing. There is a room for you. James, show them. James pointed toward the back of the property, toward the stone servant room. We've taken the liberty of moving your essential items, the things you packed for Hawaii and a few boxes of immediate necessities, into the detached unit out back. It's the only part of the property you have access to for the next 72 hours while you arrange for a moving truck. After that, any property left on the premises will be considered abandoned. The servant room? Sarah shrieked. You want us to stay in that cold shed with 2 children? It's a room, Sarah, I said, echoing my father's words from the day before. And it's more than you deserve given your attitude. The main house is under alarm. If you try to enter, the sensors will alert the security company and the police will be here in 4 minutes. Don't try the windows. Don't try the back door. I turned and walked toward the front door. I pulled out my new key, slid it into the lock, and felt the smooth, heavy click of the deadbolt retracting. I stepped inside the warm, sunlit foyer, my foyer, and turned back to look at them one last time. Robert was standing in the driveway, surrounded by his expensive luggage, looking at the house like he was seeing it for the first time. Mark was cursing under his breath, looking at the deputies who were waiting for them to move. Have a nice day, I said, and I closed the door. The fallout was absolute. In the hours after I closed that front door, the silence of the house felt different. It didn't feel heavy or oppressive anymore. It felt clean. From the window, I watched through the blinds as the 2 deputies escorted Robert and Mark toward the back of the property. Mark was still shouting, his face a contorted mask of disbelief, while Sarah followed behind, clutching the children and her designer bags, finally realizing that the luxury life she'd been living was built on a foundation of stolen equity. Robert didn't fight as much as Mark did. He seemed to have shriveled. The man who had sat at the head of the table for decades, calling his daughter a leech and a liability, was now walking toward a cold stone storage room with a single suitcase and a duty-free bag from Hawaii. He finally understood that the duty he had so arrogantly demanded from me was the only thing that had kept him from being homeless. For the next 72 hours, the back garden was a staging ground for their downfall. I remained inside the main house, working with James to finalize the permanent eviction filings. I could hear the sound of moving trucks and Mark's truck idling in the driveway as they hauled away the furniture they'd bought with the money I'd provided for bills. Every time a heavy piece of furniture left the house, I felt a layer of trauma leave with it. Mark's collapse was the most immediate. Without my $2,800 monthly contribution subsidizing the mortgage and utilities, his high-interest debts came screaming home to roost. Within 6 months, the Ford F-150 he was so proud of was repossessed from the driveway of a cramped 2-bedroom rental. He had to face Sarah and their kids without the shield of our family's wealth, a wealth he had never actually helped build. Robert's reality was even harsher. Once the trust was fully settled in my name, I stood my ground. I didn't pay his debts, and I didn't offer him a room. He was forced to move into a small, subsidized senior apartment in a part of the city he used to look down on. He lives there now on his meager Social Security checks, the very same checks he used to blow on expensive dinners while I paid for the roof over his head. As for me, I didn't just keep the house, I transformed it. I spent the next 3 months renovating. I tore down the dark, heavy curtains Robert loved and replaced them with glass and light. I turned the formal dining room, the place where they had so often mocked me, into the headquarters for my own architectural firm. I took the servant room at the back, the place where they tried to break me, and I had it demolished. In its place, I planted a garden full of white lilies and cedar trees. Peace didn't come from the money or the title. It came from the realization that I was never a leech. I was the architect, the foundation, and the owner all along. I just had to stop letting them tell the story. Now, the only voice heard in this house is mine, and for the first time in 31 years, it's a voice that is finally, truly free. Sitting here today, looking out at the cedar trees from my office window, I realized that I didn't just save a house, I saved myself. For a long time, I let my father and brother define who I was. I accepted the label of leech because I was afraid that standing up for myself would mean losing my family. But the truth is, I had already lost them the moment they decided that my value was tied only to my bank account. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a silent partner in their own entitlement. If there is one thing I've learned from this entire ordeal, it's that boundaries aren't just about saying no. They are about protecting your peace and your future. My grandfather knew this. He saw the cracks in the family foundation long before I was even born, and he left me the tools to fix it. He knew that feelings can be manipulated and memories can be twisted, but a legal document remains cold, hard, and honest. As I always say now, paper remembers what feelings forget. To anyone out there who is currently being treated like a stranger in their own home, or the responsible one who is being gaslit by the people you are trying to help, please protect yourself, keep your receipts, read the fine print, and never feel guilty for demanding the respect you've earned. You are not a leech for wanting what is rightfully yours. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this journey. If Chloe's story resonated with you, or if you've dealt with a similar family betrayal, please share your experience in the comments below. I read as many as I can, and your stories often help others feel less alone. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of people standing their ground. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care of yourselves and your foundations.